and welcome to Music of the Two Rivers. Today we're going to be talking about the music in the second episode of the Amazon Prime TV show, The Wheel of Time. Before we get into that, I'd like to give a little bit of insight into one of the things I talked about in my last video, my review of episode 1 of The Wheel of Time, specifically regarding the criticism that the music is too modern for this particular setting. While Robert Jordan was still alive, he answered a lot of fan questions about the setting of his world and many other things. I highly recommend looking up those various Q&As to get a bit more insight into the world if you've read the books. One fan asked, how big are the cities in the Wheel of Time? And Robert Jordan in his answer said, Tar Valon has 500,000 people, and cities like Camelin and Tyr are around 300,000 or so. I've envisioned a 17th century society, and you've got to remember that for those times, 300,000 would be huge. With that context, we can envision the world of the Wheel of Time as being equivalent to our world in the 17th century. In the 17th century, there were a variety of instruments being used in the Western world. Think the lute, the harpsichord, the harp, the organ. However, most of the instruments we think of today when we're thinking about classical music didn't actually exist in their current form way back then. Take the violin, for instance. It was not standardized until Antonio Stradivarius came along. It wasn't until about 1680 that Stradivarius really started hitting his stride in his career. So for the vast majority of the 17th century, we did not have a standard form of a violin. We had what's called the viol or the viola da gamba and various different iterations of what would eventually become the violin. Stradivarius kept refining how he made a violin until his death in 1737, and by that point we got the blueprint of what the best type of violin would be, and we've stuck to that over the last couple hundred years. But even aside from that, Stradivarius's instruments are not exactly like what we use today, because the instruments we use today generally are strung with metal strings, and those didn't come into practice until the early 1900s, I think about 1910. Additionally, if you look at bows, the modern bow looks something like this. This bow is from about 1920, but it's the same kind of shape that we have today. Whereas bows in the Baroque era looked more like this. They have a greater curve that's bowed outward rather than inward. They're shorter, and they have a different frog shape and tip shape, and they are also narrower in the hair. They play completely differently. The modern violin is actually a huge departure from what we would have seen in the 17th century. This is true for pretty much every instrument out there. Some instruments didn't even exist until even later than the violin, and they've still been refined up until very recently. The fact is, instruments go through this evolutionary process as time goes on, and what we have today does not resemble what we had even 20 years ago. That being said, the instrument that I see criticized the most is the use of an electric guitar. Now, if we allow the use of a violin the way it currently is, the modern instrument, because we can excuse that some iteration of the violin existed back in the time period that the Wheel of Time is most similar to, then we have to also excuse the use of an electric guitar. The electric guitar didn't really come into use until 1936. Correct me if I'm wrong. But the guitar has actually existed for thousands and thousands of years, far longer than the violin. So if we're going to allow the use of a modern violin with modern strings and a modern bow, then we can allow the use of a modern guitar with modern electricity. That's the end of that rant. Now let's move along to episode 2. So the very first thing we get in this episode is a glimpse into the White Cloak camp. The White Cloaks quickly have their own motif. F sharp, E flat, D. It's this very creepy sounding thing because it doesn't really fit into a diatonic key. This motif goes from this augmented seventh, then down a minor second. It's this very jarring sort of thing. And if we just look at the framing structure of it, the F sharp to the D, then we have this lovely major sixth, but that E flat is just what makes it a little bit creepier than it would otherwise be. The goals of the White Cloaks are very noble. I mean, when you get down to it, they're really trying to accomplish the same thing as most Aes Sedai. However, the way they go about accomplishing that goal is not necessarily good, and plenty of people do the things that the White Cloaks do not because they share that really great goal, they just want to torture people. Look at Valda versus Bornhold. I won't go into a lot of detail about all of that. I just think it's a very clever way of representing the White Cloaks. This theme comes back when we see the White Cloaks again in this episode, and it's just as creepy then as it is in the beginning. The music starts playing before we see the White Cloaks, and it sets the scene so well. Now let's get into talking about the theme song. The most interesting part of this song is that the one power motif thingy that I identified in the last episode, it comes back and it plays throughout almost the entire piece. If you look at the first album for the Wheel of Time that has been released, this actually comes from the song entitled Moraine. It seems that I was wrong in attributing this theme to specifically the One Power. It's more about Moraine and the conflicts that she faces. Given that they've made this show around Moraine, making her the main character, it makes sense that her theme would have a major role to play in this opening number. The orchestration of the theme song is mostly stringed instruments. Got a little bit of percussion in there and a little bit of voices, but mostly it's violins, cellos, and guitars. The visuals on the screen show the weaving of this tapestry. The instrumentation is all strings as we're watching something being woven with strings on screen. I mean, it's a bit on the nose, but it's clever. This episode is very connected to the first episode in that the musical themes do carry over from one to the next, and it makes sense to watch them one after another. This show was clearly designed to be binge-watched. We see Egwene and Moraine over this stone channeling the One Power, and it's Egwene's introduction to the One Power. And we hear those familiar chimes letting us know that's what's going on, but we also get the sounds of a flowing river directly paralleling the scene that we got in the first episode. In this episode, episode 2, we get a lot of the use of sounds that aren't instruments in the music. The two biggest instances of this are the sounds of the river in this scene, and later on when we get Perrin versus the wolves, or Perrin with the wolves, depending on how you want to look at that scene, and Lorne utilizes the sounds of wolves howling, or what sounds like wolves howling, in the soundtrack. I'm a 21st century musician. I love the use of non-standard instruments in music. Everybody knows about the typewriter concerto. This is the same sort of thing. There are a number of moments throughout the episode where, just as in episode 1, the music suddenly stops because something happens on the screen. However, in this episode, it's really abrupt, and it's kind of annoying because it happens a lot. When Egwene stops feeling the magic in the stone, when Perrin is interrupted by Egwene, and then when Rand wakes up, each of these 3 moments we have the music build and then suddenly stop. It makes sense, musically speaking, with what Lorne is trying to do. It seems to be a habit of his, but it's very jarring that it happens frequently, so frequently, in such quick succession. Now, I know I praised the use of this particular technique in the previous episode, but in the previous episode it only happened a couple of times. Here it happens way more frequently, and it becomes a bit blasé. It's like having a slice of chocolate cake every single day of your life. You're gonna get tired of it within a week. But if you have a slice of cake maybe once a month or so, it remains a treat. Now, just before the White Cloaks arrive, we get this nice little interlude. A gentle electric guitar with stomping and clapping going along. I just wanted to point out this moment because this particular musical number is really pretty. Musically, it's my favorite part of the whole episode, and I'm a bit bummed out that even though it comes back again, it's not really elaborated on very much until the credits. The majority of the music in this episode is really ambient. It's not really something that you can quantify really well, and it eventually turns into something that has a rhythm, that has a tempo, but I'm not really going to comment too much on ambient tracks because they're not something that really adds anything to the scene other than enhancing what's already there, which isn't a bad thing or a good thing, it's just a thing. I will note that the wolf moment with Perrin, again, is one of the most clever uses of ambient track because it's very hard to notice the shift from ambient to measured. And the music in that scene is just so very well done. You've got the wolf howls, obviously representing the wolves, and then you have this cello line that kind of comes out of it. I guess that kind of represents Perrin's trepidation here. And then as Perrin realizes, oh, they're not going to eat me, the guitar comes in, and it's just very well done. Now let's talk a little bit about the piece Sing of Manetheren. This is our first moment really of in-world music. Yeah, we get the stuff with Beltane in the previous episode, but this song is the first one where our main characters are the ones producing the music. Matt is the one who starts singing. Why exactly is up for debate. But you see him look around at his compatriots, and then he just begins this song. One by one, his friends join in. First Egwene singing the same line, then Perrin on the bass line, and then Rand just clapping along on his leg. Rafe Judkins said in a recent interview, "I had to fight very hard to get that to screen because for some reason people didn't want a 4-minute monologue on horseback in a television show that's supposed to be like a rip-roaring action adventure. They're like, why is she telling us that story on for 4 minutes while everyone listens? But I think it's just so important to the DNA of the series, we had to get that there." Now, when I first read the books, this scene really stood out to me, or the equivalent in the books. They aren't on horseback, and she's not just telling this story to the trio plus Egwene in the books. She's actually telling this story to the whole village of Emond's Field. This scene stood out to me when I was first reading the books for 2 reasons. First, because it really establishes there is a world here, there is a history. We get that with the prologue in the books, but this moment, this speech, really enhances your view of this culture and this land and these people. The second reason is a spoiler for the books, so if you haven't read them and you don't want things spoiled for you, please skip on ahead. Later in the books, Moiraine develops a relationship with Tom Merlin. In this moment, she is doing the job of a gleeman. She tells a story and it invokes such emotion in everyone that listens, and they're all just so hooked on what she says. And Tom is there watching her. Both of them have this ability to just command a room. Their presence fills it, and everyone's eyes are on them. After Moiraine finishes telling this story, if I'm remembering correctly, Tom watches her as she leaves. It is the moment that made me ship them. While I'm a bit bummed that we didn't get that speech in the Two Rivers with Tom there, it still is a very touching moment, and I think it works for the TV series. Instead of being a big show-stopping moment, it's a very intimate conversation, and the nature of the song is perfectly tied to that. It's something that was a part of their childhood, this song that they don't even know what it means. It's just a comforting relic of home. This whole scene is my second favorite scene in this whole episode, my first favorite being Nynaeve coming in at the very end because I love Nynaeve. When I watched this, I wanted to do an arrangement of the song, and I realized that the melody was very conducive to ragtime music. Think Scott Joplin, the Maple Leaf Rag, that sort of thing. So if you want to check out my arrangement, it's right here. It is the Manetheren Rag. So, moving on. The music in Shadar Logoth is very interesting. Notably, there's no music. Like they say, there's no birds, no bugs, nothing. I think the choice not to have music when they're first entering the city is a very good choice because it really points out how silent this city is and how creepy this place is. If there had been any music there, it would have taken away from what was happening, and really music should add to what's happening on the screen. In this city, the music only starts when characters have an internal monologue going on. There are two moments where this happens. First is when Rand goes off exploring on his own because he's an idiot, and we have these voices of the dead being mirrored through strings and winds and brass, and Egwene comes up and joins him, and it's this very hopeful, longing sound that really is quite touching, and it tells you what is going on in Rand's head, what's going on in Egwene's head as they're looking out on this dead city. The second moment is when Matt is talking to Perrin. Once again, when Matt is speaking, there's no music. It's only when we cut to Perrin's face and we hear what's going on in his head through the music that the music starts up again. A big part of Robert Jordan's books is the internal monologues that we hear, what's going on inside of characters' heads, because there's a lot of point of view stuff going on. We switch between the points of view of literally hundreds of characters. Obviously, an internal monologue isn't really going to work in the show. This isn't a Christmas story. It would be very out of place to just have a disembodied voice talking all the time. So I think that's what the music is trying to do. It's trying to replace the internal monologue. In the review I did of the first episode, I noted that Matt always has just silence whenever he has a character moment, and it's somewhat bugging me. Now, in this episode, we get a really important Matt moment where he picks up the dagger. And in that whole scene, there's no music except for 3 moments. First, when he wakes up, as the city kind of wakes him up, I guess. Second, when he sees the dagger. And third, when he picks up the dagger. And that's it. They're very brief moments where the music happens and then suddenly stops. And the music is mostly comprised of whispering voices. I really think, given that scene, that the choice not to have any music for Matt is intentional. I'm actually very intrigued and excited to see what they do. Now, there was only one moment in this episode that drew me out of the action, and it is very similar to the moment that drew me out of the action in the first episode, in that it's a percussive line that reminds me of Skyrim when they're escaping Shadar Logoth. I don't know why, in these high, intensive conflict moments, he's defaulting to this percussion line that reminds me so much of Skyrim. I guess the thing that bothers me most is that these moments feel like a video game to me and not like a show. And I guess that could be a purposeful choice. In a video game, you are the character, you are experiencing all of this firsthand, whereas in a TV show, you're watching other characters experience this. I guess Lorne could be trying to make it feel like a more immersive experience for the viewer, but honestly, it causes the opposite for me. Skyrim has been around for, a decade? And it's very, very well known, and it's very much a part of the fantasy literature that's out there. Having something that so closely resembles it, whether intentional or not, is just kind of jarring, and it just ruins the experience for me personally. It might be a moment that other people love, but as a massive fan of Skyrim, who is also a musician and pays a lot of attention to music in shows, it just draws me out of the action entirely. And that's really disappointing because, like the Trolloc attack, this is the height of the episode. It's the climax. It's when all of the tough stuff is happening and we've got to get through it. I want to be immersed in that moment. I want to be on the edge of my seat thinking, what happens next? I don't want to be leaning back going, oh, this sounds so much like Skyrim. Let's end with my overall impression of the music in this episode. It's not as cohesive, immersive, and memorable as the first episode by far, save for Sing of Manetheren and the theme song. We do get the introduction of the White Cloak's motif, and that's very creepy, it's very well thought out. But all in all, the music in this episode isn't as compelling as the music in the first episode. That's all for today. If you'd like to check out the review I did for the first episode, it's right here. If you want to check out my arrangement of Sing of Manetheren, it is right here. That's all for today. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe if you want to see more of this kind of content. And I'll see you guys next time for my review of episode 3 or my arrangement of the theme song. We'll see which comes first.